Thanks very much for that, Hilda. A very important reminder of why we're all here this weekend, and a very powerful presentation. I think FAC is one of the most interesting things that's developed out of the Hazards campaign over all the years it's been working, and it's been very useful and important to have that story told to us to remind us of where we are. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. It's a great pleasure to introduce Hugh Robertson, who for the last 15 years has been Head of Health and Safety at the TUC. He is in the process of trying to retire, taking a little longer than he thought he was going to do to get himself out of there. Unfortunately, the TUC has actually not managed yet to appoint a successor to him either, which is because of they've changed the job description and a few other things as well. So they have another go at trying to fill the post, I think after Congress this year, they're advertising again for somebody to do some work in developing health and safety and carrying on some of the work that Hugh's been doing. Over the 15 years, Hugh has actually made a tremendous impact because he came from an organising background in Unison, and he's always had that organising at the heart of the work he's done. But he's also made himself a bit of an expert on the health and safety side of stuff as well, particularly on work-related ill health. And has been very influential, not just with the TUC, but at the European level with the ETUC and with the global unions as well, and raising issues such as stress, MSDs, violence to staff, and all sorts of stuff like that. He's going to talk this evening about toxic work.
Thanks a lot. Yes, so it says in the programme, retired. I'm sort of retired. It's that I've got so much leave to take actually, so I don't retire till the end of the month. I'm just not doing any work. It's a very nice situation to be in. What I'm going to talk about is toxic work. Now, we've heard from Hilda a lot of the real effects that we've seen from work. And what I'm going to hopefully show is that the idea of toxic work is actually the byproduct of what we have now as a broken regulatory system. Because we're told a lot by a lot of academics, by politicians a lot, and by Public Health England and other public health people, that work is good for you. You know, we hear it all the time. You know, work is good for you. Well, so yeah, I mean, basically this is how work is good for you, which is, you know, the 20,000 plus deaths every year as a result of work. Not just the injuries that we see in the workplace, but the 10, 15,000 people who actually die as a result of workplace cancers, the many others who die as a result of heart attacks and other illnesses caused by work, and of course those killed on the roads through work. These figures, the 20,000, is actually based on HSE figures, but many think the real total is considerably higher than that. We've also, of course, got 500,000 people suffering from work-related stress. But, you know, so the idea that work is good for you as a sort of concept, clearly, you know, has got problems with it. But work actually, you know, if it was organised properly, you know, doesn't have to be harmful to everyone. Those who aren't working are 3 times more likely to be ill, and are actually more likely to die as a result of that. So it's not the idea of just doing work that's toxic. From most people, being work's a lot better than doing nothing. But for far too many of us, the workplace is a dangerous place. And it's not because work in itself is damaging, but because the way that employers actually treat us, or more accurately, how they're allowed to treat us. So the problem, you know, is bad work, it's bad employers, and the idea that work's good for you, it perpetuates this idea that the problem with health and safety is you've got a few bad employers out there who are breaking the law, and you know, all the rest of it's fine, you're much better working. You know, but the problem is, you know, this little band of bad people, you know, the sports directors and the Amazons, whoever. But I think the problem is really the system of regulation and enforcement we've got, which means basically employers can get away with doing virtually anything, particularly when it comes to ill health. Because all workplace deaths and illnesses are preventable. But the regulations we've got and the way that they're enforced are so weak that employers have basically got virtually no incentive to solve the problems that are killing us and making us ill. So, you know, most employers, who are actually some of the worst offenders, don't consider themselves to be bad employers. And if you look at NHS trusts, how many of them are going to think that they're in the same, you know, the same sort of league as people like Sports Direct? But in actual fact, they often have much higher levels of stress, much higher levels of musculoskeletal disorders, because they can get away with it because everyone thinks, because of the financial pressures they're under, that in actual fact, they've got to put patients first. So the fact that many of them treat their staff dreadfully, is allowed. There's very little enforcement action against them. So what I'm going to do is to actually deal with 3 issues. Workplace standards, by that I mean the workplace exposure limits, asbestos and stress. So we'll start with workplace exposure limits, right? Now the biggest problem with workplace exposure limits, which we've got for a whole range of chemicals, is to give this idea that there's a safe level to work at. And this is very dangerous, especially when we're talking about carcinogens. There is no safe level for anything that causes cancer. What the limits are is their compromise. Okay? There's no evidence based. I'll give you 2 examples to show that. Silica is the first one. Basically, silica is all around us. It's in sand and just any building site. You'll get lots of silica in quarrying, even mining, and so on. Now, it's responsible for 800 lung cancer deaths every year. It also causes a huge number of other illnesses, particularly sort of chronic obstruction, bronchitis and so on, plus silicosis. Now we've got an exposure limit. That's what it is. So, does it mean that so long, that the problem is, the reason these deaths are happening is because employers are working to well above that exposure limit? Not necessarily. Because if you're exposed to that level, and many people are, you've actually got 25% chance of developing silicosis if you were exposed to that over 13 years. That's at the level which employers are allowed to actually work at. Now, even a limit of half that, we'd still be having, rather than 800 deaths, we'd be having 200 deaths. And 5% of those who are exposed to even half that current legal exposure limit will still be developing silicosis over their working lives. The idea that exposure limits are safe, when we're talking about hundreds of deaths from people who are actually working in things like quarrying and construction, just shows what kind of problem we've got. Diesel's another example. Diesel, similar number of deaths, about 700. Diesel again, all around us. The EU's proposing a limit again. That's what the limit is. Is that safe? Well, the experts who advised the EU recommended a limit that was actually 3 times lower than that. Just employers and governments, including the British government, said that would be unrealistic. But even at the lower rate, which is a third of what is recommended, they recognised there would be 4 deaths in every 1,000 people who've got regular exposure at that level during their working lives. And given the number of people who are actually regularly exposed to diesel, in terms of things like garages, warehouses, factories and so on, that's an awful lot of people. So what we've got is this myth that so long as employers actually work to these exposure limits, workers are protected. That is not true. But also, first of all, how do employers actually even try to find out if they're meeting exposure limits? Do the HSE really think that most employers are actually monitoring exposure? It's not happening. A few big ones perhaps are, but how many construction sites have you ever seen actually measuring the sort of exposure in the air during a refurbishment, for instance? How many garages actually measure the levels of exposure to diesel exhaust? And even if they are complying with the regulation, which virtually none of them are, because most of them don't know what they are, at these levels, hundreds of people are still going to die. And I'm talking about hundreds of people, not just 1 or 2, both for silica and diesel. So the issue shouldn't be, however, whether or not they're breaching the limit, because that's not what the law actually says. The law doesn't say, you must not breach this limit. It says that you've got to reduce exposure as far as you can. That's what the law actually says. For instance, on dust, TUC has said that if you can see dust, there's a problem, you should deal with it, right? If there's any dust that you can see, you've got particles there, people are breathing in, they don't know what's in that dust, whether silica, asbestos, cement, whatever, you know, basically sort it out. You know, we should all have a right to clean air. Likewise in diesel. If you can smell or see diesel exhaust, you've got a problem in your workplace. Your employer should deal with it. Yet even they are working under the workplace exposure limit. It's as simple as that. What limits do is two things. First, they give the impression that it's safe to work anywhere below that limit. It's a lie, because there's no safe limit for any carcinogen, and these are carcinogens. And also it means the HSE isn't enforcing the law, which says that the employer must actually reduce as far as is reasonably practical. That's what the Health and Safety at Work Act, you know, says. Section 3 of the first Health and Safety at Work Act, you know, the most important part of it. Basically, you know, you reduce the risk as far as is reasonably practical, not as far as you can get away with. And in both diesel and silica, it's actually very easy often, in many workplaces, to reduce to well below these limits. It just employers don't. And the HSE does not enforce. I've never heard a case of the HSE actually enforcing against an employer because they're not reducing exposure levels as far as reasonably practical, despite the fact that's what the law actually says. Now, I'm not saying exposure limits don't have their place, they do. But I do think we should totally review how we're actually using them and focus much more, not on exposure limits, but the reduction of exposures as far as reasonably practical. And that means much more inspection and much more enforcement. Now, move on to asbestos. Asbestos. Well, asbestos, you know, as you all know, it's been banned for over 20 years or so, we're always told. Now, the lie that we've got here is that we get it from the government, we get it even from the HSE, that, you know, by banning the importation and use of asbestos, you know, that controlled the risk. Okay? There's nothing to worry about now. And the people who are dying now, these 5,500 people who are dying every single year, are dying because they were exposed before the ban. That is not true. For 15 years, the HSE has been telling us the level of deaths from mesothelioma is going to peak very shortly. In 2004, the year I started working for TUC, they said the deaths were going to peak at 2010 at 1,500 a year. In 2004, they said deaths were going to peak at 2010 at 1,500 a year. In 2009, they said it was going to peak at between 1,950 and 2,450 sometime between 2011 and 2015. Well, we're now in 2019. The death toll is still rising, still over 2,500. So now the HSE is telling us it's going to start falling after next year. Right? They've been telling that for the last 15 years. So, you know, are these all because of exposure before 1999? All the ban meant is that employers can't actually make the problem worse. That's actually what the ban means. It's done nothing about the 6 million tons of asbestos that was in place before that. I know you want to ask something, but do you mind doing it at the end? Is that okay? So the HSE has actually admitted that 1.3 million tradespeople are actually at risk of coming into contact, and many of them actually come into contact with asbestos now, in 2019, on average, more than 100 times a year. We're talking about carpenters, joiners, sort of gas fitters, and so on. This is now. And millions more are at risk because they work in offices, schools, and shops and so on, where there's hidden asbestos. which could be disturbed at any time. The regulations just are not fit for purpose because they only deal with cases where asbestos has been identified and has been worked on or removed. There's no requirement for employers to have any kind of plan to remove the asbestos in place. And the HSE says it's safer to do that, keep it in place than remove it. That is rubbish. How much asbestos any workplace is actually going to remain untouched for the next 20, 30, 40 years? You know, someone is going to drill into it at some point. You know, we have got no plan whatsoever to remove it from the estimated 500,000 workplaces where it still is. And meanwhile, people will continue to die. So it's not a historical problem, it's still a high one. So very quickly, moving on to stress. Okay? Again, you know, it's as much a legacy of toxic work as chemical exposure. You know, 500,000 cases. And it's more than that, that's what the HSE says. But if you include all the cases that are caused by financial worries, then these are also linked to work as well, just as much. So again, the law is clear. The requirement is to reduce exposure in case of stress as far as reasonably practical. HSE thinks that is too difficult. You know, basically, you know, at least we've got some kind of regulations on things like chemicals, musculoskeletal disorders, noise, and so on. But absolutely nothing on the biggest cause of sickness absence. They've given up on that whatsoever. We've got the stress management standards, which are okay, but the HSE gave any attempt even to promote them in 2010, and done absolutely nothing since. In fact, during the 10 years since we've had the stress management standards, the number of stress cases have actually increased. So basically, because HSE's been doing nothing, you know what's happened, employers have been doing well-being, resilience, and all that kind of thing. Reality is, what we haven't had from the HSE is one single prosecution of any employer who's actually making their employees ill, despite the fact that the law is quite clear. You know, they are breaking the law. So I just want to conclude, because I'm running out of time. So basically, how can it be that employers are allowed to operate workplaces that cause well over 20,000 of us to die prematurely every year? As said, 45 years ago, there was a legal duty on employers to remove risk as far as reasonably possible. Not as far as is reasonably profitable. That's not actually what the Health and Safety Work Act says. Also, not as far as the HSE will let you away with, which is effectively what those few employers who actually still see the HSE do. The requirement is still there, but it's of no use when you've got regulations that weaken that very basic principle. And the Act is also useless because no one is enforcing it in most cases. Now, given the events of last week, which I'm sure all of you know, we now have one of the most right-wing governments in recent history. Okay? Now, a lot of the papers have said, it's the most right-wing government since Thatcher. I don't think it is, because in Thatcher's government, we had some, people like sort of Redwood and Tebbit, but we also quite a lot of what are called one country, one nation Tories and so on. There's none of them now. We've just got right-wingers. And look at their record on health and safety. You've got a Prime Minister who believes that, or said during in recent years, that he actually wants to get rid of what's called the social contract part of the European Union's work. Basically, all the stuff to do with equalities, health and safety. He doesn't think there's any need for that, right? He also wants to get rid of the Working Time Directive. We've got the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who said she wants to halve the amount of social regulation, including health and safety we've got. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who I don't know what the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster actually does, but it's good. And his job's apparently to sort out Brexit. Again, he wants us to withdraw from the social, all the social justice parts. And we've got a leader of the House of Commons called Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I don't want to misquote him, so I'm just going to say exactly what he said, which is, We could slash safety standards a very long way after Brexit, and standards that are good enough for India should be good enough for the UK. So, it's tempting, and I think for a lot of us it will be. It'll be tempting to say our priority has to defend what we've got, the regulations that we've got. But we know the natural fact they don't have to deregulate, don't have to remove regulation to do things. Basically, all they've got to do is stop enforcing and inspecting. And that's what they've been doing for the last 10 years. So just saying, we don't want them to remove the regulations we've got from Europe. Well, that's the fact that ignoring half the regulations in Europe in most workplaces is not enough. That's why it's not enough to say, let's fight for the status quo, because the status quo is what is leading to 20,000 deaths a year. Okay? So let's not get caught in the trap of saying we just have to stop deregulation, and instead demand they actually start regulating properly. And that's not about laws. It's not what the law says. It's about having inspectors there. It's about hauling people up to the courts, because that's what real regulation is. So just finally, that means starting inspecting again. It means starting prosecuting employers on health issues such as stress, not just safety ones. It also means starting prosecuting employers who continue to employ us, even though they're actually sort of working within the exposure limits. Of course, now that's not going to happen just suddenly. We're only going to change that because we're going to be able to build strong, confident trade unions. Without that, we're not going to get any change. Health and safety reps, you see, the health and safety isn't about regulation. It's not about what the Health and Safety Work Act says. It's about what's happening in the workplace. It'll only change when employers are forced to have respect for their workers and are no longer allowed to treat them as a disposable asset, which is what we're seeing now. So, and if there's no one else who's actually going to do that for us, It's no point just making demands on the HSE or the EU or, some of the